Most of our learning should be a protection from the Yeshua. Gula. We're going to start Tzadik Vav and Beis. We'll start from Mikad Demasni La'aresha. See that let's go back to the Mishnah and discuss a few points over here. Outside, Rabbi Yeshua says that sometimes a Pesach or a Tmuras Pesach is brought and sometimes it's not. Rabbi Kiva explained, it depends if the extra sacrifice was there at the time of the Shechita. If it was there at the time of the Shechita and you chose one of them, that means you were doicha the other one and then it can't be brought as a shlamim. And what do you do with it? You wait till it gets a mum and you sell it and then you bring the new one as a shlamim. It's called Yirad Shiyistad. You let it get a mum. Now, when does it need to be there to be nidcha? That was a machlokes between Rabbah and Reb Zera. Rabbah says that if you found the lost animal, and if you had two animals in front of you before the shechita, so then comes along the shechita and makes one of them into a nidcha, pushes it off, and you can't use it. Reb Zera says that doesn't have to do with shechita. That has to do with before chatzos. If you found it before chatzos, then comes along chatzos and makes it a nidcha. If you find it after chatzos, then you're all set. You're all set. There's no problem, even if it was before the shechita. Okay. Then we said an interesting statement of Rabbah. Over here it says Rava, but we said it was in the name of Rabbah. The statement went like this: that the halacha that if the korban Pesach that was lost is found after the shechita, so then you can bring it as a shlamim. It wasn't around by the shechita, so it wasn't nidcha. So it was a lost korban Pesach. It becomes a shlamim. It wasn't nidcha. It wasn't there at the time when the other one was shechted to be a nidcha. Comes along, that's the Mishnah. Comes along Rabbah and says that was only if it was found after the shechita. And he takes it a step further with the Tamura, and then you do Tamura on it. So the same halacha would apply to the Tamura. He says, when do we say that halacha applies to the Tamura? That you then exchange the found animal for another animal, that it could be shechted and it could be considered that it could be brought as a shlamim. That's only if it was all after the shechita. But let's say you found the first animal before shechita, and then you did Tamura after the shechita, which means the first animal has a problem because it was nidcha. The Tamura was done on an animal that was nidcha. So then we say that what's the source of this kedusha? Kedusha d'chuya. So therefore the Tamura is also d'chuya. Even though the Tamura came after the shechita, which normally anything after the shechita of the first animal is not d'chuya, but because the original animal that is, when you do Tamura, you put the kedusha from one onto the other. Even though I'm doing this Tamura after shechita, but because the kedusha that it's coming from is d'chuya, so this one is so it becomes a korban that's d'chuya as well. It has to get a mum. Okay, we had a question on that, and then we have a new ikad demasni la'aresha. Some learn the statement of Rabbah slightly different. Comes out the opposite. Goes like this. Some learn what Rabbah says on the first part of the Mishnah. We're starting at 6 lines from the bottom. A Pesach shenimtza kedem shchita, so Pesach Yirad Shiyistad Yimkem v'yavi b'dam shlamim v'chein tmerasek. Let's say you have a korban Pesach that gets lost, so you designate another one, and then you find the first one. And when you find the first one, now you have two in front of you. So you go and you shecht one of them, the second one. What do you do with the first one? So you have to wait till it gets a mum. And then after it gets a mum, gets a blemish, then you go ahead and you sell it as a regular animal. You take the money and you use that to buy a carbon shlamim. But that animal itself was already nidcha because you found it before the shechita. V'chein tmurasi, and the same thing will apply if you did tmura on it. You exchange the animal that you found for another one, that you have to wait till it gets a mum, and you sell it, and you bring a carbon shlam with that money. Amarava, lo yishanu. This was taught. This was not taught. That means this was only taught. Lo yishanu ela. B'medvar mamurim is lo yishanu ela. This was only taught that you can't bring this offering itself as a shlamim. You have to let it get a mum, and then you sell it, and then you bring a new shlamim. All the problem was only if everything was performed before the shechita. You lost it before the shechita, and you found it before the shechita, and you did tmura before the shechita, and then you did shechita. So the shechita really messes up everything else because it's doicha everything that you had before. Interesting case. You find the lost animal before the shechita. What do you have to do with this? You have to wait till it gets a mum. But you did tmura on this animal after the shechita, probably before it got a mum. You did a tmura on it. So was the tmura done before the shechita, that the shechita of the real carbon pesach should be doichedes? No, the tmura was done after the shechita. So it says tmurase kreva shlamim. Very interesting. Exactly the opposite of our maskana before. Over here we'll say that even though it's coming from kedusha dechuya, we don't say that according to the ikad the masnila seifa. See the opposite. We say that this animal could be brought as a shlamim. Its source, it's better than its parent. It's better than its source. The source had to get a mum. This could be brought as a shlamim. My timer. What's the reason? Kikava shchita. What does the shchita establish? In other words, what does it push off? Midi de chazila. Only something that could be brought as a carbon. It says this is being brought as the carbon, and that gets to chuya. That gets pushed off. Midi le chazila le kava. But this wasn't done tmuran yet. The shchita is what pushes it off, and the shchita didn't push it off because the tmura wasn't here. The tmura only came afterwards. It wasn't kodesh. Couldn't have been brought as a carbon. It wasn't kodesh yet. So this pshat in Rabbah, this way of learning Rabbah, doesn't view that I look at the parent kedusha and say that the extended kedusha of the tmura is going to be the same as the parent. No, I look at the shechita, and the shechita pushes away whatever was done, whatever is available at the time of the shechita. But whatever is available after the shechita, they can't push that away. Okay, Isri Abaya has a question on this. Im Kesef, same brisa we quoted before, we just elaborate differently. Abaya quotes this brisa. It says by the carbon shlamim that you could bring a sheep or you could bring a goat. If you bring from the sheep in Kesef, why does it have to repeat that? It already says in Minat Zayin. It says L'Rabbi's Tmuras Pesach Achar Pesach Shekrei B'Shlamim. It's coming to tell us that a Tmuras Pesach after Pesach is brought as a shlamim. Okay, no problem. I had a carbon Pesach and I did Tmura on it. It's brought as a shlamim. Okay, a carbon Pesach that wasn't offered is brought as a shlamim. No problem. Yachal af lefnei Pesach came. Maybe even before Pesach, it could be brought as a shlamim. We didn't hear anything about this before. Talmud Laimar, it's the pasuk says who kara vein Tmurase kreva, vein Tmurase Pesach kreva. Only it is brought as a shlamim, but a Tmuras Pesach is not brought as a shlamim. It's coming to tell me before Pesach, whatever the case is, you can't bring the carbon Pesach as a shlamim. It's after Pesach that it's brought as a shlamim. So we go back and we say Hechidami. What are we talking about over here? If we're talking about that the Tmura was done before the Shechita of the carbon Pesach, and we say that you can't bring it as a shlam, okay, fine. When I do the Shechita, I'm doicha everything that was there, I push it off, and I can't bring it as a shlamim. But the Gemara says pshita. For that, you need a pasuk to tell me in Keser or who that this is what's brought. We knew that already. So it says lama likra. Why do you need a pasuk to tell me? We're talking about that the first Korban Pesach was found before the Shechita. So when I do the Shechita, that becomes a nidcha. That becomes pushed aside and it can't be offered. However, I do the Temura on it after the Shechita. Now this is going to be a Chiddush. And the Chiddush is that you can't offer that either. Because it comes from Kedushat Chayim. Tifta the Rava, or the Rabba. It's a question on Rabba. Because we said before that you don't view that. You view the Shechita as pushing off only what's there at that time. Is Tifta the Rabba? Tifta. The question. Okay, that's this Gemara. The two versions. We end up with a question on the second one. Okay, new case. That's coffee, by the way. Let's put it. I have to clarify. Okay. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, "Kol shebechatas mesa b'Pesach karev shlamim, v'chol shebechatas raya b'Pesach nami raya." Okay. Shmuel's complicating things. It looks like he's making things simple. He's making rules for us. You see, there's two possibilities with the Korban Pesach. That's not being brought as a Korban Pesach. One possibility is you bring it as a shlamim. That's we've seen that before. Other possibility is you have to wait till it gets a month. Okay, so Shmuel, to help us out, tells us that what we're going to do is we're going to take that same scenario and we're going to look at what would happen by a Korban Chatas if that same point would happen. So he says like this: anything that a Chatas would be put to death, there's 5 basic Chatas that are put to death, which means that they can't be offered as a sacrifice. Those are, for example, if a Chatas was a female, I think it is a female, then it has a child. What do you do with the child, with the offspring of the Chatas? There was no sin that's necessary for it, but he can't just bring it as another sacrifice. It's a Chatas. That offspring is put to death. A Tmura's Chatas is put to death. Usually, a Tmura of a Shlamim, I bring the first Korban, I bring the second Korban. So it's just the Shlamim. But over here, it's only brought for a sin. There was no sin, so it's put to death, etc. There's a bunch of these that are there. Okay, so if that would happen, too, one of them is Chatas Niskapru Baleh, a Chatas that the owners brought a different one. They had a different sacrifice. This was an extra one. Yeah, this one was lost. That's what happened. This one was lost. I found it, so therefore I designated another one. Then I go back. Oh, I found the old one. So the one that I found has to be put to death. So Shmuel tells me, Kol shebechatas mesa b'Pesach karev shlamim, I would bring it as a shlamim if it's a Korban Pesach. So let's think about that case again. A chatas that gets lost, and I bring another chatas. The first one is found. It's put to death. The same thing would happen to a Korban Pesach. I lose it. I designate another one, and I find it. This is going to be the complication of here. It's brought as a shlamim. Okay. Then it says, Kol shebechatas roya, anything that a chatas needs to get a mum, the Pesach nami roya. That's the interesting one. Pesach, you also have to wait till it gets a mum. And what's that case? What's the case of a chatas as roya? We have to see what's going on. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan is in the same time as Shmuel, same generation. He says he's in Eretz Yisrael. Shmuel's in Bavel. Shmuel's in Nardoi. Eina Pesach karev shlamim ela shenimta achar shchita aval koydem shchita loy. When would it be brought as a shlamim? That's only if I find it after the shchita. But if I find it before the shchita, then I can't offer it as a shlamim I have to wait till it gets a mum, and then I sell it, and then with the money I buy a shlamim. Rabbi Yochanan fits with what we've understood before. Yeah, the conclusion of this Gemara, to simplify it for you, is that if you remember, we had one other opinion here. That other opinion was that it wasn't the shechita that determines what's happening. It was chatzos that determines what's happening. Remember that? So Rabbi Yochanan, it's very clear that it's all the shechita. And Shmuel doesn't tell us exactly what's going on. So we have that other card to play with, that chatzos card. That could be that's what Shmuel holds. But before we get there, we start off with some questions. Maskeflo Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef has a question. Klolahu, you're going to make this into a rule that we're referring to the chatas roya, any chatas that's has to graze, you can't offer it as a chatas, and you don't put it to death. Instead, you just let it get a mum. Then you, after it gets a mum, you sell it, and then with the money, I guess you use it for something else. So the same thing would apply in that same scenario. If it would be a carbon pesach, it's also roya. It's also you let it graze till it gets a mum, and then klolahu, that's a rule. Or a chatas she'avra shenasa d'l'riyazla. What about a chatas that got too old? You let it get a mum. Dam Rab Shimon ben Lakish chatas she'avra shenasa reinais a kilo emed space akvaris. Rab Shimon ben Lakish gives an extreme description here. He says there's nothing you can do with this chatas. Which means, what is it? How does he describe it? There's nothing you can do with it if it got too old. He says it's like, imagine it's in a base of chorus. The kohen cannot get in there to get it. It becomes like inaccessible. That's what he means. It got too old, so it's as if it's in the base of chorus. That's his example. So v'raya, you have to just let it get a mum. V'ilo b'pesach ki agavna karb shlamim. What? By a carbon pesach, you have to let it get a mum, according to Shmuel. That's not what you do with it. That we know what the halacha is. A carbon pesach that gets too old, it's over a year, right? The carbon pesach needs to be brought in the first year. If it's over a year old, so then it's brought as a shlamim. Titania, kesev l'rabis is a pesach la'aliyah. When it says kesev, it's coming to include the tail that's brought on the altar, right? It's brought on the altar. Kshuaymer im kesev l'rabis is a pesach shavar shnasa. Yishlamim abba machmas pesach l'chol mitzvah shlamim. That basically a carbon pesach that yes, he said. Oh my gosh. Okay, very nice. The carbon pesach that's brought that's too old. The year went by. It's brought as a shlamim, not roya. So the comparison, chatas roya, supposed to be a pesach roya, that we're not seeing. We're seeing that a chatas, which is roya, pesach is brought as a shlamim. It's a kasha on Shmuel. What was the case? We're talking about when it gets too old. And the Brisa finishes off. Okay, it's coming to tell us that the goat that's brought as a shlamim doesn't have an aliyah, doesn't have the fat tail. So this was a question that Rabbi Yosef is asking. I believe he's asking it to Shmuel. Amarlei, if anyone has an English Gemara, tell me which name it adds to the Amarlei. That's one of the problems in Gemara. It's too many pronouns. He said to him. I believe Shmuel responded to Rabbi Yosef, but I don't know if that's possible. He responds, he says, Kika Amar Shmuel. No, it's impossible that Shmuel says. Kika Amar Shmuel. It can't be Shmuel that's talking. There's a maskefla. Doesn't say to him. Okay, he responds that what does Shmuel say? Shmuel was talking about Ba'avudim. Seems what's happening here is we were talking about here that the carbon got lost. I designated another one. Then I find the first one. So in those cases, then it depends. If that would have been a chatas that would have been put to death, then if it's a Korban Pesach, then it's brought as a shlamim. And if that would have been a chatas that gets a mum, right, raya, that you let it graze until it gets a mum, then a Korban Pesach would also get a mum. Shmuel was never talking about b'dechuyin, where it just got too old. B'dechuyin means that it wasn't physically lost; it was halachically not acceptable. For example, it got too old. B'dechuyin lo yamar, Shmuel wasn't talking about that case. So the question that you had was not exactly the scenarios that Shmuel was talking about. Shmuel was talking about only when it actually physically got lost. Okay. V'avad mi mishkachas la. Do you actually have a case of an animal that gets lost, that it goes and it grazes? We do have a case like that, but it's not going to match up to the Korban Pesach. By the Korban Pesach, what's supposed to happen is if you have a similar scenario by a chatas that's raya, that's what's going to happen to the Korban Pesach. We're going to find that there is an opinion that holds that there is a Korban chatas that's raya. The problem is that case is not going to match up to the Korban Pesach, that it should be raya as well. The Rabbanan say that if it's avuda b'shas hafrasha, at the time that I designate the second one, and then you find the first one, goes like this. The Tanan was taught in the Mishnah. Hiprish chatasi va'avda. Someone designates a chatas. He did a sin. He has to bring a chatas. So that's what he did. He designates a carbon. He's going to bring it. However, va'avda, he lost the carbon. The Hiprish, he doesn't have good luck. The Hiprish acheres tachtea, and he designates a new one. V'nimtza sarishayna, and after he designates a new one, he finds the old one. Harishtem imdas. Both of them are standing in front of him. He could bring them as sacrifices. Achas me'am tikra v'shniya tamas. One of them is brought and one of them is put to death. I think it's clear that one of them, which one is brought, but over here makes it look like either one. After the fact, it's for sure either one. One of them is brought, one of them is put to death. Dibri Rebbe, that's the opinions of Rebbe. That's the opinion of Rebbe. Now, that doesn't help us at all. We weren't looking for that. We weren't looking for a chatas that's put to death. That we have many cases. What we're looking for is a chatas that has to graze. However, the Chachamim say, "Ein chatas meisel shnimtzas lacher sheneskaper bailing." When would I have to put this chatas to death? That would be if I already offered the first one and then I found the second one. Then it would be put to death. Hakodim sheneskaper bailing. But if I find it before the replacement was offered, so then raya, I let it graze. Very interesting. I let it graze. I have a case of a chatas that grazes and gets a mum. Okay. Vilu b'Pesach, but now let's compare that to what would happen by a Korban Pesach. Heichad da'avad v'nimtza acher chatzais. Koydem shchita. Complicate things now. Let's say I find it, I lose the Korban Pesach. Okay, so I designate a new one. I find it after Chatzos. Before the Shechita. We had an opinion before that says that if it's found after Chatzos, it's not the Chuya. The Machlokes Rab and Reb Zera. The Gemara here is following Reb Zera that says that Chatzos is determined. So once you found it after Chatzos, even though it wasn't offered yet, Karev Shlamim. It's offered as a Shlamim. See? It doesn't match up to Shmuel's rule. Shmuel gave us a rule. If a Chatas grazes, then a Pesach has to graze. Here we're seeing that the Chatas grazes because it was found before the offering was, the old one was found before the replacement was offered. And when you compare that to the Korban Pesach, it's found before the offering was offered and it's brought as a shlamim. Yeah, the simple answer to this would have been for the Gemara to say, we're not following Reb Zera, we're following Rabbah. That would have been it would have ended the Gemara right here, but the Gemara doesn't do that. The Gemara says, Shmuel Karebi Svirle. Remember over here what we said? We had two opinions. A chatas that was lost and then you designated another one, and then you found the old one. Rebbe says that even if they're both in front of you, you found it before they're both in front of you, one of them is put to death. You were telling me that this is a case of that you let one graze. Turns out that that's only according to the Chachamim. Shmuel doesn't hold like that. You were asking me a question on Shmuel if he would follow the Chachamim. He doesn't follow the Chachamim. He holds like Rebbe. It says that this is not a case of grazing. This is a case where it's put to death. It says that if it gets lost, it's put to death. If it gets lost and then found, and I have a replacement of it, then it has to be put to death, no matter what the scenario is. So I don't have a case of Raya that you can ask me any questions on. It doesn't match up to the case of the Korban Pesach. Gemara says, 1 second, you resolved it so well that you messed up the other side. Problem is that according to Rebbe, there is no raya. There is no animal that by a chatas that grazes. But by a Korban Pesach, we do have a Pesach that has to graze and get a mun. Shmuel said both. You were trying to tell me that Shmuel holds like Rebbe to avoid getting any questions on Shmuel, and tell me that that's not a case of where a chatas needs to graze. But what you do what happens when you do that is you leave me without any grazing by a chatas, but I still have a case of grazing by a Korban Pesach. My answer is, the case that you just told me, you see, the problem is it won't match with Rebbe. The problem is like this. According to Rebbe, if the animal is lost, it has to be put to death once it gets lost and found. Now, by a Korban Pesach, it's not always the case like that. By a Korban Pesach, if it was found before Chatzos, it's not put to death, it grazes. Doesn't match up with the opinion of Rebbe. Rebbe wouldn't have a grazing. Rebbe would have only put to death, and we have a grazing it because it's a case of lost. And in other words, this wouldn't match with Rebbe. The Gemara says, "Kedem chatzos lavavada, kideravad amarava aveda slayla lapshmei aveda." You're telling me that it doesn't match with Rebbe because it got lost, and according to Rebbe, it would be put to death, and according to Shmuel, it grazes. The truth is that this is not a case of getting lost. Why? What's considered lost? So someone says, I lost my keys. Oh, I found them. No, they weren't really lost. They were here. I didn't look yet. It's only lost when I needed them and I didn't have them. So that's what's considered lost. So over here, if I have a korban that gets lost before Chatzos and it's found before Chatzos, so I didn't need it until Chatzos because it can't be offered until Chatzos, so it was never considered lost. So you're asking me a question, what's going to happen if I find the Korban Pesach before Chatzos? You're going to tell me that it grazes, but according to Rebbe, a lost korban is put to death. Doesn't match up with Rebbe. The truth is, don't worry about that, because that was not considered lost according to anyone, according to Rebbe, because that wasn't considered lost because you weren't able to offer it. It was found before Chatzos. At the time that it was able to be offered, it wasn't lost. Similar to what Rava says about a regular korban, that if a korban is lost by night, it's not considered lost because we don't offer sacrifice by night. The problem is now, the question that we mentioned before, that there's no such thing as raya, according to Rebbe. Everything is always put to death, according to Rebbe. It says, Kid Rabbi Shia. Rabbi Shia, you're going to follow what Rabbi Shia says. If someone goes to the store, he doesn't know what to buy. His wife said he should get something, this or that. So he has to get both. He doesn't know what she wants. So just in case, someone designates a korban Pesach, but he doesn't know, should he be designating this one or that one? So he designates both. One of them is for achrayas. Over here, it's maybe he's going to lose one of them. He wants to have an extra one. So, I'm sorry, this is a carbon chatas. He designates 2 carbon chatas, just in case he loses it. So what happens is, miskaper bachas memish niyatera. This is a case where by a chatas you would be roya. Va'ilu bepesach ki agavna karib shlamim. The Gemara is saying that we have a case of roya by chatas when you designate 2 for achrayas, just in case. So now we compare that over to a carbon pesach. We want to say that anything that by a chatas is roya, that you let it graze till it gets a mum, by a carbon pesach, we also let it graze till it gets a mum. The problem is that this is not the case of a carbon pesach getting lost. This is a case which is called moisar pesach, an extra carbon pesach. What's the case? What's it in by an extra carbon pesach? It's clearly brought as a shlamim. Again, the case that we brought to resolve our problem turns out doesn't resolve the problem, because it's not a case where a carbon pesach would be grazing. It's a case where a carbon pesach was brought as a shlamim. Ella, we have to say Shmuel Reb Shimon Svirle. We thought Shmuel was holding like Rebbe, because we had a problem before that we had a case where a chatas would be roya, but that's that same case by a shlamim, by a pesach would be offered as a shlamim. It doesn't match up according to Shmuel's rule. So we say that Shmuel holds like Reb Shimon. Damar chamesh chatois mesos. Says there's only 5 chatois that are put to death. Okay. What are we gaining by this? We're going to have that. Why does the Gemara jump into this as if this is going to be better than Rebbe? But let's see. The Gemara right away asks a question on this. But Reb Shimon Leslie, Klal. But Shimon doesn't. Reb Shimon doesn't have. Reb Shimon doesn't have a case of where a chatas needs to graze to get a mum. The Gemara says Shmuel Nami Chadakamar. Oh boy, everything that we were learning, all our problems, the Gemara resolves by just erasing one line. Shmuel didn't say Kol shebechatas roya b'pesach nami roya. Shmuel only said Kol shebechatas mesa b'pesach karib shlamim. There's no case of roya by chatas. That's what we're saying now. Shmuel nami chadakama. Kol shebechatas mesa b'pesach karib shlamim. The Gemara says, well, my kamashmala. Well, what's that coming to tell me? What's the chiddush now? Anytime there's a problem with the carbon pesach, it's left over or something and it wasn't offered, you just bring it as a shlamim. There's no chiddush in that. That we know from the Mishnah. Gemara says no. Lafukim mit Rabbi Yochanan. He's coming to exclude what Rabbi Yochanan taught. Damar Rabbi Yochanan said, "Eina pesach karb shlamim nimtza acher shchita." When is it possible for a carbon pesach that's left over to be brought as a shlamim? That's only if, because it was lost, and then I designated a new one. When did I find the first one that was lost? After the shchita of the first one. Aval koydem shchita loy. But if you find it before the shchita, then I can't bring it as a shlamim. Why? Because it was nidche. Al mashchita kava. Why? Because the shchita is what makes it into a dechuya. Kamash Malan, Shmuel's coming to teach me that chatzais kava. Exactly the way we mentioned before, that this was going to be the maskana. That Shmuel was only telling me that kol shebechatas mesa meant to tell me that it's not the shchita that's going to determine if the carbon pesach is offered as a shlamim. It's going to be chatzos. Once chatzos comes, then if I find the old carbon pesach that was lost, then I can bring it as a shlamim. Even if it's there by the shchita, doesn't matter. That's what Shmuel holds. And Rabbi Yochanan held no. If it's there by the shechita, then it becomes rejected. There's another interpretation, another version of this. And what's going to happen is we're going to go back, we're going to have the same conclusion at the end. It says like this. When it comes to a carbon Pesach, we're going back to this stage of the Gemara. If it was found right after we brought the Brisa of Rebbe and the Chachamim, we say when it comes to a carbon Pesach, if it was lost, but you found it after Chatzos, Kodim Shchita, that's before Shchita. What did we say before? After Chatzos, before Shchita. Korab Shlamim, brought as a Shlamim. Who holds that? Who said that was the opinion of Reb Zera? Says that once Chatzos passes, then it's not considered D'chuyah. It was found after the Zman of the Shchita. It's not the Shchita itself that pushes off, it's the Zman of the Shchita. If the Zman came and you had found it already, then it would have been D'chuyah. But the Zman came and you didn't find it. You only found it after the Zman came. So then it's not D'chuyah, and you can offer this extra Korban Pesach as a Shlamim. The Gemara explains, Shmuel Kirabba Svirele, the Mashchita Kava. What was our problem? When we said this, we were asking a question that we had a scenario that according to the Rabbanan, a chatas in such a case would graze. The Rabbanan held that if I lose a korban chatas and I find it before the second one is offered, before the replacement is offered, the Rabbanan hold that you let it graze. You let the first chatas that was lost graze. When it comes to a korban shlamim, when it comes to korban Pesach, you offer it as a shlamim. That was inconsistent with Shmuel. So the Gemara answers, don't worry about that inconsistency, because Shmuel holds like Rabbah, and Rabbah holds Svirlei Damer Shchita Kava. Because when did you find the korban Pesach? Before it was offered. That was similar to when did you find the chatas before the other chatas was offered. And what happens then? By the chatas, it's roya, and also by the korban Pesach, it's roya. You let it get a mum, according to Rabbah. Yeah, we didn't take this route last time. Last time we were following Reb Zera that says no. In such a case, you offer it as a shlamim. But we can resolve the whole issue by saying Shmuel holds like Rabbah that says, oh, it was found before the shchita. The shchita determines it and pushes it off. It's roya. We have the case of a chatas that's raya, we have a case of a korban Pesach that's raya. They match up perfectly. But midam Rabbi Yochanan Allah in a Pesach korban shlam melish nimsach shchita avol kedem shchita loy al mashchita kava mechlal the shmuel savar chatzos kava. 1 second. But Rabbi Yochanan says shchita kava. According to you, Shmuel is the one that's saying shchita kava. So the shchita as establishes. We wanted to say that Shmuel holds chatzos kava, that Shmuel would hold like Reb Zera. Ela Shmuel Kurebi Svirli. Rather, Shmuel holds like Rebbe that case wasn't even a chatas raya case. That case was a chatas that's put to death. The Maravudul Misazla. The Gemara says 1 second. Vaha kol avudul Rebbe Mason. Vilu Pesach David kain chatzos and nimtzu kain chatzos raya. It can't fit with Rebbe. Rebbe says every time it gets lost, it's put to death. By a korban Pesach, by a chatas, it's put to death. By a korban Pesach, we have cases where it gets lost and it grazes. We answer that answer that it's not a problem because kodim chatzos is not even considered lost. So Rebbe would say it's put to death only when it's actually lost. Before chatzos is not considered lost, and chatzos is what determines everything. Okay. Let's leave the Gemara here. We'll learn on Sunday at 6 o'clock. Yeah, we're gonna start.